Hello and welcome to the video tutorial for the CJ dress. This dress is available for purchase on my Etsy. It is available in sizes extra small through 3XL. It's a pretty straightforward dress and it's available in mini, midi, and the full length. I try to break it down step by step, but as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. And let's get started sewing. So we are going to start off working on our top. So you can see here I have all of my pieces cut out in my main fabric. I have a center front, 2 side fronts, 2 side backs, and 2 middle backs. The first thing I'm going to do is interface all of these pieces. This helps give my top a little bit of structure, so I'm ironing on a light to midway interfacing, and this is what that's going to look like. Now to get started sewing, I start with one side, then I move on to the next before connecting them at the center. So we're going to start off with our center back and connect it to our side back and sew this along with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now that I have those 2 pieces together, I'm going to take my side back and connect it to my side front and do the exact same thing with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now before I connect my center piece, I'm going to repeat those exact same steps for my second side. This just helps everything get even. So if you start to get off a little when you're sewing, when you do it 2 separate ways, it doesn't just continuously get more and more off. So now I'm going to take one side and connect my center front, and then I'm going to repeat that for my other side until I have a fully completed corset. Now that everything is put together for our top piece, I'm just going to press all of those seams. When I get to the center front to get that curve super flat, I'm going to use a tailoring ham, or you can use a bundle of t-shirts, whatever you have, just to make sure your seams get nice and flat. Now that we have this, we are going to repeat all of those exact same steps that we just did with our lining fabric. Here my lining is in red. You can see I have it completed and it looks just like my first top. But set that aside for now. We will come back to our lining. We are going to first bone our main fabric top. For the boning, I'm using a 1/2 inch sew-in boning. We're only doing 2 boning channels, that is at the center front and side front seam, and I'm going to measure how long I need my 2 boning channels. I'm going to leave 3/4 inch at the top and 3/4 inch at the bottom. Also, if your boning has been all rolled up like mine has, you can do a low heat press on it, and this will help just make it a little bit straighter. It might make your life easier. Now we're going to take our boning and we are going to sew it into our seam allowance. By sewing it into the seam allowance, you won't see any of the lines on the outside of the garment. It will only be sewn into that seam allowance on both sides of the seam allowance. So our bone will kind of be in the center. So my garment is folded over, as you can see, and I am only sewing my boning onto that seam allowance. When that's done, I'm going to turn it around and do the other side so that my boning is sewn into each side of the seam allowance. When you're done, it should look something like this, and now we are just going to repeat those exact same steps for our other side. Once your top is completed and boned, just like you did with your lining, we are going to set that aside. We are going to work with it again later. Now we're going to grab our skirt pieces. I'm starting with the back, you can see here, and I have my darts marked with chalk. I'm going to fold those in on each other with the right sides facing, and I'm going to sew down the darts on all of my pattern pieces. So there's 1 dart on each back piece. There's 2 back pieces. And then after I've sewn these down, I'm going to go to my center front piece, and there are 2 darts on my center front, and I will sew this down just like I have sewn my back pieces. Now that all the darts have been sewn for these skirt pieces, we're going to start connecting our skirt. With my skirt laid out and right sides facing, we are going to connect both side pieces to their coordinating side. Again, right sides should be facing, and I like to pin this together all at once, or you can do one at a time, whatever you prefer. Once this is all pinned in place, I'm going to take it to my sewing machine, and we are going to sew down our sides to our front skirt. Now this is just the top view, but your skirt should look something like this, and now we're going to connect the top to our skirt piece. Again, this is with your right sides facing, so I have my top flipped down to meet my skirt, and I'm going to attach the ends, and then I like to go back and attach all of the seams so that everything is lining up all nice and neat. And once all of that is pinned or clipped down, we are just going to sew those 2 pieces together. Now before I move on to doing the exact same thing with our lining, we're just going to trim a bit of that seam allowance to help everything lay super flat. Now back to our lining, I have repeated the exact same steps that we did with our main skirt to my lining, and I am doing that top that we created earlier and connecting it to my skirt piece just like we did our main fabric. After that's all sewn up, it should look something like this. This is the top of my dress. We are going to connect our lining to our main fabric dress. So we're going to place these right sides together and we're going to pin just at the top, aligning all of our seams. Once everything's matched up nice, we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we are going to sew our lining to our main fabric dress. Now before we flip it inside out, I'm just going to cut off a little bit of that seam allowance so it lays super flat. Also, to help it lay flat, when I get to those curves, I'm going to do little tiny slits that'll just help this lay really nicely. And now that all of those have been cut, I am going to turn my dress inside out and I'm going to press my lining and my main fabric so that that looks really, really sharp. This next step is optional, but I'm going to do a top stitch. The only difference is when you're doing a top stitch, start about an inch after your center back opening. We're going to close this back up after we add the zipper, so start a little bit off and we'll finish that later. But right now I'm just going to go through it and I'm going to add a top stitch on the top of my dress, and that'll all look like this once we're done. Time to move on to our zipper insert. I'm using an invisible zipper. This one is a little long. I'm going to trim it a little bit later, but I would suggest using an 18-inch zipper. It always helps with an invisible zipper to roll out the teeth with your iron. You just gently take this and press the teeth outward so that they're not rolled in. Now that our zipper is ready, we are going to start. We're going to add our zipper to our main fabric first, but to start, I'm going to take my lining out and above my dress so it's kind of out of the way. Now I'm going to take my zipper and starting with one side, I'm going to flip the teeth so they are facing away from the center back. Once they're away from the center back, I'll take my pins and I will start pinning this into place, and then with an invisible zipper foot, I will go ahead and sew this on. Before we move on to the other side, I'm going to zip up my zipper, make sure everything looks fine, and I'm going to take a piece of chalk and mark on my zipper where it meets that center seam for our top connecting to our skirt. So this way, when I redo this zipper, which we're going to do the exact same, we are going to take the teeth and face them away from the center back opening, and I'm going to make sure that chalk mark that I just made matches up with that same center seam of the top connected to the skirt, so that way I know that my zipper is even once we're done. So that side of your zipper just like we did the other side, and we are going to now close up the bottom. We're going to turn this dress inside out once more, and we're going to pin right up where our zipper is. You want to sew like right underneath that so everything is matching up and you don't have any holes coming from your back seam to your zipper. If you are doing the midi version, you can see I have a chalk mark right here. That's marking where my vent is going to be. You will only sew down to there. If you are doing the full length or the mini, you will just sew down the remainder of the skirt. Another thing is you can see I've switched to a normal zipper foot instead of an invisible zipper foot. This helps me get really, really close to that zipper, and I think is a little bit easier and the easiest foot to get a nice clean continuation from your zipper to your center back seam. Now we're just going to press that back center seam flat. If you are doing the vent, make sure you press flat in the exact same way that you were before, because you're going to sew those down for your vent. So having those lines pressed already will make that so much easier. Now finally, we are going to connect our lining to the zipper. I'm bringing my lining up and over, and with the right sides facing and the teeth still facing away from the center back, I am going to pin and sew. So I'm basically sandwiching in my zipper, again with the teeth still facing away from the center back and the right sides facing of my lining and my main fabric. I'm going to go ahead and do this on both sides. It's a little bit easier, or you can do one at a time. It's up to you. But make sure when you're doing this, you're also matching up those seams of your top to your skirt piece so that everything is lining up really, really nice. Once everything's pinned down, it should look something like this, and we're going to take it back over to the sewing machine, still using my regular zipper foot, not an invisible foot, to sew all this down. Once both sides are done, we're going to do just like we did on the other side and close down that center back seam. And again, we want to get right up there with where the zipper ends, and we want to stop if you're using an open vent. And again, if you're doing the mini or the full length, you don't have to worry about that vent, just sew all the way down. Then just like we did with our main fabric, we're going to press everything down. Now I'm flipping everything right sides out, and we are so close to having an almost completed dress. You can get out your zippers and they should look something like this. They look nice and sharp from the outside and the inside. Now we're going to turn back a couple steps before where we left off a little bit for that top stitch. Now I'm going to close up my top stitch for both sides. We are so close to done. All that's left to do is hem our dress. I'm using a rolled hem. If you have a vent because you're doing the midi, I suggest doing that last. If you're just doing the mini or the full length, you are just going to hem this with a rolled hem. I'm choosing to do mine separately. You can add your lining to your fabric, but I'm doing a rolled hem for both, rolling them both inwards towards each other. When you're doing this rolled hem, you should not have any raw edges coming out. Your lining and your main fabric, all your raw edges should be totally concealed. Now this is only if you have a vent. We are going to close that up. Remember, we pressed down our seam allowance when we were closing that center back seam. This is what's really going to help our vent look super even and nice. And I'm also making sure I clip at that very top. So I'm going to sew down one side, and I've already sewn down one side. Here I am getting to that top of the vent, and I'm just going to do a quick back and forth stitch to close up that very top. You can see I'm just going to go back and forth. And then once I do that back and forth, I'm going to set my needle down, put my presser foot up, and then go down the opposite side. So this way our vent is totally closed. Both sides are closed, and the top has that little back and forth stitch. And that should look all nice and neat. Now that you're done, we are just going to press everything. If you didn't have the vent, you could have already been pressing. You're done with your dress. Congratulations. I hope you love it. Please let me know if you have any further questions, and follow along if you want to see what the next pattern release will be.